Have you ever felt called to something greater but hesitated because of uncertainties and challenges? The story of Abraham, a lesson in faith and obedience to God, might be just what you need to find strength and inspiration. Abraham was an ordinary man called by God to leave everything he knew and follow a path filled with challenges and grand promises. On his journey, he faced doubts, fears, and immense sacrifices, but his unwavering faith and obedience were rewarded in unimaginable ways. If you've ever wondered how to move forward when the future seems uncertain or how to trust in God's promises amid difficulties, Abraham's story can provide answers and hope. Together, let's discover how faith and obedience can transform your life just as they transformed Abraham's life. Get ready for a journey of faith that promises to touch your heart, inspire your soul, and show that with God, all promises can become reality. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to do so, and let's begin our journey of learning. It was a distant time in an ancient and prosperous land called Ur of the Chaldeans, where a man named Abram lived. Abram was an ordinary man with his daily responsibilities, his family, and his chores. He lived with his wife, Sarai, and had many possessions, servants, and animals. Life in Ur was comfortable and secure, but God had a grand plan for Abram, something that would change his life forever. On a quiet night, as Abram gazed at the stars in the sky, he heard a voice. It was not an ordinary voice. It was the voice of God. "Abram," the voice said, "leave your country, your people, and your father's household and go to the land I will show you." Imagine the surprise and mix of emotions that Abram must have felt. Leaving his homeland, his relatives, and everything he knew to follow a divine voice to an unknown destination. However, God did not just call Abram to an uncertain journey, but also made an incredible promise. "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This promise was monumental. God was not only promising protection and blessings, but also that Abram's descendants would become a great nation, and through him all families on earth would be blessed. Abram had a decision to make: remain in the safety and comfort of Ur or obey the divine call and venture into the unknown with faith in God's promise. The first leg of the journey took Abram and his group to Haran, a vibrant city on the way to Canaan. Haran was a strategic stop, allowing the caravan to rest and resupply for the next part of the trip. Leaving Haran, the landscape began to change. They passed through arid plains and rocky hills, facing the intense heat of the desert by day and the biting cold at night. At each stop, Abram built an altar and worshipped God, thanking him for his guidance and protection. These moments of worship were not only a sign of his devotion, but also a way to remind everyone of the divine promise that propelled them. The journey was long and full of challenges. The caravan faced sandstorms that obscured the path and made progress difficult. But even in the toughest situations, Abram kept the faith. He knew that God was with them, guiding them every step of the way. During the journey, Abram took time to teach his family and servants about faith in God. He shared stories about the creation of the world and the promises God had made to him. These lessons were essential to keep morale high and hope alive. Finally, they arrived in the land of Canaan, the destination promised by God. The journey had been long and full of challenges, but the sight of the fertile and promising land filled Abram's heart with hope and gratitude. Canaan was a land of green hills, lush valleys, and abundant rivers, a striking contrast to the arid deserts they had crossed. As they camped in Shechem, a central region of Canaan, Abram felt God's presence in a powerful and unmistakable way. On a quiet night, as Abram contemplated the starry sky, God appeared to him. God's voice resonated, clear and imposing, bringing a promise that would shape Abram's future and that of his descendants. "To your offspring, I will give this land." God's promise was monumental. Abram, a man who had left everything to follow the divine voice, now received the assurance that his descendants would inherit that blessed land. He would not only receive a portion of land, but an inheritance for his entire lineage. The enormity of this promise was hard to comprehend, but Abram believed unwaveringly in God's word. To mark this sacred moment and demonstrate his gratitude and devotion, Abram decided to build an altar. With skillful hands and a fervent heart, he raised stones one by one, creating a structure that would be a symbol of his faith and covenant with God. Upon completing the altar, Abram offered sacrifices and prayers, praising the Lord for his faithfulness and promises. Each stone of the altar represented a step of faith, each sacrifice an expression of gratitude. Abram knew that this was not just an act of worship but also a testimony to everyone around, a constant reminder that God had promised that land to his descendants. This altar would become a point of reference, not only geographically but spiritually, in Abram's journey and in the history of the people of Israel. The construction of the altar also served to consolidate God's presence in Canaan. It was a declaration that this place now had a divine purpose and would be the home of a nation chosen by God. For Abram, the altar was a way to consecrate the land and seal God's promise in his heart. To everyone traveling with him, that altar was a reminder that they were in a promised land, guided by a God who keeps his promises. Throughout his life, Abram would build other altars in different locations in Canaan, each marking significant moments in his journey of faith. Abram and his family were settling in Canaan, the land that God had promised to him and his descendants. However, life in the new land soon became challenging. A severe famine hit Canaan, drying up crops and depleting resources. The lack of food became a real threat to the survival of Abram, his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his servants and animals. Faced with this crisis, Abram made a courageous but risky decision. He decided to go down to Egypt, a land known for its abundance and constant supplies, even in times of famine. The journey to Egypt was not easy. They faced hot days and cold nights, walking through arid terrains and treacherous deserts. But Abram kept the faith, believing that God would guide them and provide what was necessary to survive. As they approached Egypt, a concern began to grow in Abram's heart. He knew that Sarai was an extremely beautiful woman and feared that, upon reaching Egypt, the men would desire her and, because of this, might kill him to take her as a wife. Worried about this possibility, Abram suggested to Sarai, "Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake and my life will be spared because of you." When they arrived in Egypt, exactly as Abram had feared, Sarai's beauty caught the attention of the Egyptians. Soon, news of her beauty reached the ears of Pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt, who immediately sent for her to be his wife, believing she was Abram's sister. In return, Pharaoh treated Abram with great generosity, giving him many gifts, including cattle, camels, servants, and riches. But Abram's decision to lie brought unexpected consequences. God did not allow Sarai to stay in Pharaoh's palace. Instead, he afflicted Pharaoh and his household with great plagues. Confused and fearful, Pharaoh called Abram and asked, "What have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she was your sister so that I took her to be my wife? Now here is your wife. Take her and go." With this, Pharaoh ordered that Abram, Sarai, and all their belongings be escorted out of Egypt. Abram obeyed, and thus, even in the face of his mistakes, God demonstrated his faithfulness and protection. Abram left Egypt with his family, richer and wiser. This experience was a turning point in Abram's life. He realized that even in times of great difficulty and uncertainty, God was with him, guiding and protecting him. The famine in Canaan and the trip to Egypt were tests of faith, and although Abram made a mistake by lying about his wife, God used this situation to strengthen his faith and trust in the divine promise. Abram and his caravan returned from Egypt with great wealth and more people than when they had left. The herds of Abram and his nephew Lot had grown enormously, and soon the land of Canaan began to prove insufficient to support both of them. The shepherds of Abram and Lot began to quarrel over pastures and water sources, creating an atmosphere of tension and conflict. Being a man of peace and wisdom, Abram realized that this situation could lead to more serious misunderstandings. He knew that to preserve family harmony, a solution had to be found. So he called Lot for a conversation. "Let there be no strife between you and me, between your shepherds and my shepherds," Abram said. "For we are relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me." If you choose the left, I will go to the right. If you choose the right, I will go to the left. Lot looked around and saw the fertile plain of the Jordan, a lush and well-watered land, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. Attracted by the prosperity that the region promised, Lot chose the plain of the Jordan and settled near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, known for their wealth but also for their wickedness. Abram, on the other hand, remained in the land of Canaan, trusting that God would bless him regardless of where he was. He moved to the hills of Hebron and set up his camp there, continuing to live a life of faith and worship. Abram built another altar to the Lord, reaffirming his devotion and gratitude for the blessings received. This separation was a decisive moment for both. Lot chose what seemed to be the most promising option in material terms, but his decision led him to live among corrupt and immoral people, which would eventually bring great trouble to him and his family. For Abram, the separation from Lot was an opportunity to renew his trust in God. After Lot's departure, God appeared to Abram again and said, "Lift up your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see I give to you and your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, then your descendants also could be numbered." With this renewed promise, Abram walked throughout the extent of the land of Canaan, from Bethel to Hebron, building altars and worshiping God in each place. He knew that regardless of appearances and immediate circumstances, true prosperity came from faithfulness to God and following his plan. Lot's life, after his separation from Abram, took an unexpected turn. He had chosen to settle in the fertile plains of the Jordan, near the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Although the region was prosperous, the cities were known for their iniquity and corruption. Lot, however, seemed more attracted by the material opportunities the place offered than by moral concerns. Meanwhile, in another part of the region, a great war was about to break out. 4 kings, led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, united to attack and subdue 5 cities in the plain of the Jordan, including Sodom and Gomorrah. The battle was fierce, and the cities of the plain were defeated. The victors sacked the cities, taking many captives, including Lot and his family. The news of Lot's captivity soon reached Abram, who was living peacefully in Hebron. Upon hearing that his nephew had been captured, Abram did not hesitate. He immediately gathered 318 trained men born in his household and set out on a daring rescue mission. Abram could have chosen not to get involved, considering the dangers and the numerical inferiority of his group, but his bravery and loyalty spoke louder. During the night, he divided his men and attacked the enemies by surprise near Dan. The strategy worked perfectly. Taken by surprise and disorganized, the enemies were defeated, and Abram managed to rescue Lot, his family, and all the other captives, as well as recover all the looted goods. After the victory, Abram returned triumphant. He not only saved Lot but also proved to be a fearless leader blessed by God. On the way back, Abram was met by Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. Melchizedek brought bread and wine and blessed Abram, saying, "Blessed be Abram by the Most High God, creator of heaven and earth, and blessed be the Most High God, who has delivered your enemies into your hand." In a gesture of gratitude and reverence, Abram gave Melchizedek 1/10 of everything he had recovered. The king of Sodom, who had also been saved by Abram, offered him all the recovered goods as a reward. But Abram, faithful to his principles and not wanting anyone to say that he had become rich at the expense of others, refused the offer, accepting only what his men had eaten and the share of his allies. Abram had already faced many challenges and trials in his life, but his faith in God remained firm. He had experienced moments of great joy, such as arriving in the Promised Land, and great difficulties, such as the famine that led him to Egypt. Each experience shaped his faith and character, preparing him for one of the most significant moments of his life, the covenant with God. One night, God appeared to Abram in a vision. He said, "Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, your very great reward." However, Abram, who was already advanced in years and still childless, expressed his concern. "Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless?" and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram feared that without a son, his promises would not be fulfilled. God responded to Abram with an extraordinary promise. He said, "This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir." Then God took Abram outside and said, "Look up at the sky and count the stars. If indeed you can count them, so shall your offspring be." Abram looked up at the starry sky, and despite his advanced age and the impossible circumstances, he believed in God's promise. That same night, God established a solemn covenant with Abram. He asked Abram to prepare a sacrifice: a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. Abram obeyed, cutting the animals in half and arranging the halves opposite each other. But he did not cut the birds. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep fell on Abram, and he was filled with a dreadful and great darkness. God promised that despite future hardships, Abram's descendants would be freed and prosper. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. This was God's way of sealing his covenant, a sign of his presence and his promise. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants, I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates." In addition to the promise of numerous descendants and the land of Canaan, God also gave Abram a new name. He said, "No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations." The new name, Abraham, means father of many nations, reflecting God's great promise that through him, many nations would be blessed. Leave a like if you are enjoying this incredible life story of Abram. God's promise to Abraham was clear. He would be the father of many nations, and his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. However, as the years passed, Sarah, his wife, remained barren. Anxiety and impatience began to grow in Sarah's heart. She knew God's promise, but her physical condition seemed to contradict what had been promised. One night, moved by desperation and frustration, Sarah proposed a human solution to the divine problem. "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my slave. Perhaps I can build a family through her." In a society where lineage and descendants were extremely important, this was a common practice. Sarah hoped that through Hagar the promise could be fulfilled. Abraham, listening to his wife's suggestion and also impatient for the promise to be fulfilled, agreed to the idea. He took Hagar as a concubine, and she conceived a child. Hagar, realizing that she was pregnant, began to despise Sarah. The tension in Abraham's household increased, and Sarah, feeling betrayed and humiliated, went to Abraham to express her anguish. "You are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Abraham, trying to pacify the situation, said to Sarah, "Your slave is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best." Sarah, in her pain and frustration, treated Hagar harshly, and Hagar fled into the desert. In the desert, an angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring of water. He called her by name and said, "Hagar, slave of Sarah, where have you come from, and where are you going?" Hagar answered, "I'm running away from my mistress Sarah." The angel of the Lord then told her, "Go back to your mistress and submit to her. I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count." And he added, "You are now pregnant and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery." Hagar obeyed and returned to Abraham's household. When the time came, she gave birth to a son, and Abraham named him Ishmael, which means God hears. Ishmael grew up and was loved by his father. However, his presence brought complications to the family. The arrival of Ishmael did not bring the peace that Sarah and Abraham had hoped for. Instead, it introduced a complex dynamic of jealousy, rivalry, and tension. Hagar, being the mother of Abraham's firstborn, had a position that Sarah, despite being the legitimate wife, had not been able to achieve. God, however, had not forgotten his original promise. Despite the difficulties and human errors, the divine plan continued to unfold. God appeared to Abraham again, reaffirming that he would have a son with Sarah. God changed Sarah's name to Sarah and promised that she would be the mother of nations and kings. Abraham's story is marked by moments of deep faith and devotion, but also by acts of compassion and justice. One of these moments occurred when God revealed to Abraham his plans for the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities were known for their extreme wickedness and corruption, and the outcry against them had reached the heavens. One day, while Abraham was sitting at the entrance to his tent, he saw 3 men approaching. He hurried to meet them and invited them to rest and eat. He did not yet know that he was in the presence of the Lord and his angels. After they had shared a meal, the visitors got up and looked toward Sodom. Then the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him." God then revealed to Abraham that the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah was so great and their sin so grievous that he had come down to see if what they had done was as bad as the outcry that had reached him. If it was, the cities would be destroyed. Abraham, knowing God's just nature, approached him and asked, "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city?" The Lord replied, "If I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Abraham, perceiving God's compassion, dared to continue interceding. "What if the number of the righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5 people?" God answered, "If I find 45 there, I will not destroy it." Abraham continued to intercede with humility and reverence. "What if only 40 are found there?" And God replied, "For the sake of 40, I will not do it." Abraham then asked about 30, then 20, and finally, "What if only 10 can be found there?" The Lord answered, "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it." Abraham's compassion and intercession demonstrated his deep love for justice and concern for the lives of the righteous. Even in a city as wicked as Sodom, Abraham showed a compassionate heart, pleading with God to save any righteous people who might be found. Despite Abraham's intercession, the corruption in Sodom and Gomorrah was complete. 2 angels arrived in Sodom and were greeted by Lot, Abraham's nephew, who insisted they stay in his house. The men of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house and demanded that he bring out the visitors so they could abuse them. Lot, in a desperate attempt to protect his guests, offered his daughters instead, but the men refused and tried to break down the door. The angels then pulled Lot inside and struck the men with blindness, so they could not find the door. The angels told Lot to take his family and leave the city immediately, for God was about to destroy it. Lot hesitated, but the angels took his hand, along with his wife and 2 daughters, and led them safely out of the city, saying, "Flee for your lives, don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." Lot pleaded to flee to a small nearby town called Zor, and the angels agreed. At dawn, when Lot and his family reached Zor, God rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah, destroying the cities, the entire plain, all the inhabitants of the cities, and all the vegetation in the land. Lot's wife, disobeying the angel's order, looked back and became a pillar of salt. That day, Abraham went to the place where he had stood before the Lord and looked down towards Sodom and Gomorrah. He saw dense smoke rising from the land, like smoke from a furnace. God had remembered Abraham's intercession and had rescued Lot before destroying the cities. Years had passed since God had promised Abraham that he would be the father of a great nation. Abraham was now 99 years old and Sarah was 89, and the promise of a legitimate son had yet to be fulfilled. Despite this, Abraham continued to trust in God, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. One day, Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent in the region of Mamre when he looked up and saw 3 men standing nearby. Realizing they were special visitors, Abraham ran to meet them, bowed down to the ground and said, "My Lord, If I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by. Let a little water be brought, and then you may all wash your feet and rest under this tree. Let me get you something to eat so you can be refreshed and then go on your way, now that you have come to your servant." The visitors accepted the offer, and Abraham hurried to Sarah and said, "Quick, get 3 seahs of the finest flour and knead it and bake some bread." Then he ran to the herd, selected a choice, tender calf and gave it to a servant, who hurried to prepare it. He brought some curds and milk and the calf that had been prepared and set these before them. While they ate, he stood near them under a tree, serving them. During the meal, one of the visitors asked Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He replied, "There in the tent." Then the Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance to the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already very old, and Sarah was past the age of childbearing. So Sarah laughed to herself as she thought, "After I am worn out and my Lord is old, will I now have this pleasure?" But the Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Will I really have a child now that I am old? Is anything too hard for the Lord? I will return to you at the appointed time next year, and Sarah will have a son." Sarah was afraid, so she lied and said, "I did not laugh." But he said, "Yes, you did laugh." This visit was a powerful reaffirmation of God's promise. Abraham and Sarah were at an age when the idea of having a child seemed ridiculous, but God assured them that his promise would be fulfilled. This moment was a final test of faith for both of them. That same year, as promised, Sarah conceived and bore a son. Abraham, in obedience to God's command, named the boy Isaac, which means "he laughs." The name was a reminder of Sarah's initial reaction to the promise and the joy that the fulfilled promise brought to their lives. Isaac's birth was a moment of great celebration. Sarah said, "God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me." She also declared, "Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." The arrival of Isaac brought not only the fulfillment of God's promise but also a profound renewal of Abraham and Sarah's faith. They learned that nothing is impossible for God. The wait, the doubts, and the challenges only served to make the joy of the fulfilled promise even more significant. Their son Isaac grew up in an environment of love and devotion. Abraham and Sarah taught him about God's faithfulness, the importance of faith, and the spiritual heritage he carried. Every day with Isaac was a reminder of God's goodness and the fulfillment of his promises. Abraham built altars and worshipped the Lord, thanking him for his faithfulness and the blessings bestowed upon his family. On the 8th day, following God's covenant, Abraham circumcised Isaac, a sign that he was part of the eternal covenant between God and Abraham's descendants. This act was more than a ritual. It was a confirmation of the special bond that God had established with Abraham and his descendants. Life in Abraham's household was full of joys and challenges. Isaac's birth brought indescribable happiness to Abraham and Sarah but also provoked tensions within the family. Hagar and Ishmael, who had previously held an important place, began to feel the weight of the change. Ishmael, Hagar's son, was about 14 years old when Isaac was born. Over time, the rivalry between the two brothers intensified. During a celebration, Sarah saw Ishmael mocking Isaac, which disturbed her deeply. She feared for her son's future and was concerned about the potential conflict between the two boys. Feeling the need to protect Isaac and ensure the line of the promise, Sarah went to Abraham and said, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." This request put Abraham in an extremely difficult position. Ishmael was his son, and he loved him deeply. Abraham was distressed by Sarah's request. He found himself torn between his love for Ishmael and his responsibility to follow God's guidance and protect the promise made to Isaac. That night, while pondering the difficult decision, God spoke to him, "Do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also because he is your offspring." With a heavy heart but confident in God's word, Abraham prepared for the painful separation. Early the next morning, he took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. With a knot in his throat, he entrusted Ishmael to his mother's care and sent them away. Hagar and Ishmael wandered in the desert of Beersheba. When the water ran out, Hagar, in despair, placed Ishmael under a bush and moved away, saying, "I cannot watch the boy die." Sitting at a distance, she began to weep bitterly. But God heard Ishmael's cry. An angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. She went to the well, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. God was with Ishmael as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became a skilled archer. His mother got a wife for him from Egypt, and he became the father of a great nation, fulfilling God's promise. Despite the painful separation, God's faithfulness remained steadfast. Ishmael was not forgotten. God had a plan for him, and he became the patriarch of a great people, just as God had promised. Although saddened by Ishmael's departure, Abraham found comfort in the certainty that God would take care of both of them. Abraham's life was marked by numerous tests of faith, but none would be as difficult as the one that was about to come. God had blessed Abraham and Sarah with Isaac, the son of the promise, and their joy was immense. However, God decided to test Abraham's faith and obedience in a way that no one could have imagined. One day, God called Abraham, "Abraham," and he replied, "Here I am." Then God said, "Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you." Abraham's heart must have tightened upon hearing these words. Isaac, his beloved son, the son of the promise, was to be sacrificed. But Abraham did not hesitate. His trust in God was unwavering, and he knew that God was faithful and just. Abraham prepared everything for the journey. He got up early, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his servants and Isaac, cut the wood for the burnt offering, and set out for the place God had told him about. The journey lasted 3 days. Imagine what must have gone through Abraham's mind during that time. Each step taken towards Mount Moriah was an act of faith and obedience. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, "Stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship and then we will come back to you." Abraham still believed in God's promise and said that both would return, a sign of his faith that God would provide. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and placed it on Isaac's shoulders. He himself carried the fire and the knife. As they walked on together, Isaac, unaware of what was to come, asked, "Father?" Abraham replied, "Yes, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered confidently, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. He then bound Isaac and laid him on the altar, on top of the wood. With tears in his eyes and a heavy heart, Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But at that moment, the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, "Abraham, Abraham," and he replied, "Here I am." The angel said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." With a sigh of relief, Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. He took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Abraham called that place, "The Lord will provide." And to this day it is said, "On the mountain of the Lord it will be provided." The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time and said, "I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed, because you have obeyed me." Abraham and Isaac came down from the mountain and returned to the servants, and together they went back to Beersheba, where Abraham settled. Abraham and Sarah's life was marked by moments of great joy, challenges, and tests of faith. Together, they walked a path of obedience and trust in God's promises. But like all human stories, there's also had moments of mourning and loss. Sarah lived to the advanced age of 127 years, a remarkable age even by the standards of the time. She was a woman of great beauty and faith, who endured with Abraham the highs and lows of their journey. However, the time came when Sarah passed away in Kiriath Arba, also known as Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Sarah's death was a painful blow to Abraham. She was not just his wife, but also his companion in faith, with whom he shared God's promises and the joy of Isaac's birth. Abraham's grief was profound, and he wept bitterly for the loss of his beloved wife. He sat beside Sarah's body, reminiscing about the moments they had shared and the strength she had shown in all situations. However, Abraham knew he needed to honor Sarah's memory in a dignified manner. He rose and went to the Hittites, the inhabitants of that land. Abraham, being a foreigner in Canaan, did not own land to bury Sarah. Demonstrating great respect and dignity, he approached the Hittites and said, "I am a foreigner and stranger among you. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead." The Hittites, recognizing Abraham as a prince of God among them, responded generously, "Listen to us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. Bury your dead in the choicest of our tombs. None of us will refuse you his tomb for burying your dead." Abraham rose and bowed down before the people of the land. He said, "If you are willing to let me bury my dead, then listen to me and intercede with Ephron son of Zohar on my behalf, so he will sell me the cave of Machpelah, which belongs to him and is at the end of his field. Ask him to sell it to me for the full price as a burial site among you." Ephron the Hittite was sitting among his people and replied to Abraham, "No, my lord, listen to me. I give you the field, and I give you the cave that is in it. I give it to you in the presence of my people. Bury your dead." Abraham, however, insisted on paying the fair price. After a respectful negotiation, Ephron agreed to sell the field and the cave for 400 shekels of silver, a considerable amount at the time. Abraham weighed out the silver according to the terms agreed upon in the presence of the Hittites and bought the field of Ephron in Machpelah near Mamre, both the field and the cave in it, and all the trees within the borders of the field. This transaction was recorded officially and witnessed by the Hittites present. With the field and the cave now legally in his possession, Abraham buried Sarah in the cave of Machpelah. This place became the first piece of land that Abraham owned in the land promised by God, a sign of the promise that his descendants would inherit all that land. Abraham's grief for Sarah was profound, but he found comfort in the assurance that God was faithful to his promises. The purchase of the field and cave was an act of faith, a declaration that he believed his descendants would possess that land, as God had promised. Abraham lived to the age of 175 years. He saw God's promises fulfilled in many areas of his life. Isaac, the son of the promise, had grown up and married Rebekah, ensuring the continuity of Abraham's lineage. Additionally, God blessed Abraham with many descendants through Ishmael and other sons he had with Keturah, his second wife. In the final years of his life, Abraham continued to be a respected patriarch and spiritual leader. He instructed his children and servants in the ways of the Lord, ensuring that the faith and divine promises were passed down to future generations. Abraham was known for his hospitality, justice, and generosity, and his life was a living testimony to God's power and the importance of trusting in his promises. When Abraham felt that his days on earth were drawing to a close, he prepared for his departure with the same dignity and faith that had marked his entire life. He called his children and blessed each one of them, leaving instructions on how they should live and maintain their faith in the Most High God. Abraham knew that God's promise extended beyond his life and that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan and become a great nation. At the moment of his death, Abraham was at peace, surrounded by his family. He died at a good old age, full of years and satisfied with the life he had lived. His sons Isaac and Ishmael came together to honor their father's memory. They took him to the cave of Machpelah, the field Abraham had bought years before to bury Sarah. There, beside his beloved wife, Abraham was laid to rest, sealing the site as a memorial to faith and God's promises. Abraham's death was not the end of his story, but the beginning of an eternal legacy. God continued to fulfill his promises through Abraham's descendants. Isaac, his son, followed in his father's footsteps, living a life of faith and obedience. Isaac's descendants, Jacob and his 12 sons, formed the tribes of Israel, fulfilling God's promise that Abraham would be the father of a great nation. The impact of Abraham's life extended far beyond his years on earth. He is remembered as the father of faith, an example of how to live a life fully trusting in God. His willingness to obey God, even in difficult circumstances, serves as a model for all who seek to follow the Lord faithfully. Abraham's faith is mentioned in various parts of the Bible, including the New Testament, where he is highlighted as an example of righteousness and faith in God. The covenant God made with Abraham remains a central part of the story of redemption, culminating in the coming of Jesus Christ, a descendant of Abraham who brought salvation to all humanity. The life and legacy of Abraham teach us the importance of trusting in God, obeying his commands, and maintaining faith even when promises seem distant or impossible. Abraham lived an extraordinary life, marked by unwavering faith, and his example continues to inspire and guide believers in their walk with God. Thus, the story of Abraham concludes, not as an ending, but as the beginning of a lineage of faith that endures to this day. He shows us that a life lived in obedience and faith in God's promises is truly blessed, and the impact of such a life can extend across generations, fulfilling divine purposes in ways beyond our understanding. Abraham, full of years and blessings, left an eternal legacy of faith and obedience that continues to echo through the centuries. If you were inspired by Abraham's story and saw how faith and obedience to God can transform lives, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments below. Which part of Abraham's journey touched you the most and why? Have you ever experienced a situation where you had to trust in God, even when it seemed impossible? How does this story inspire you to strengthen your faith and obedience to God in your own life? I love reading and responding to all comments. Let's create a community of faith and inspiration together. Don't forget to like and share this video so more people can be touched by Abraham's incredible story. See you in the next video.